The hall glowed with golden light, every chandelier shimmering like stars gathered under a single roof. Roses and lilies lined the aisle, their fragrance mingling with the faint hum of violin strings. Guests filled the pews, women adjusting their hats and men straightening their ties as the murmur of anticipation grew louder. This was not just a wedding, it was a grand event that had the air of royalty. People whispered about how perfect the bride and groom looked together, how their union felt like the ceiling of a fairy tale. At the altar, the groom stood tall, though his fingers tapped nervously against his thigh. His suit fit him like it was made by destiny itself, crisp black with a satin sheen, accented by a simple white boutonniere. His best man leaned close, whispering, "Relax, brother. You're about to marry the love of your life. You're the luckiest man in the room." The groom chuckled softly, though his throat was dry, and nodded. Lucky. Yes, that was the word everyone used. After years of building his career, waiting for the right woman, waiting for this moment, here it was. The officiant gave him a warm nod, reminding him with silent reassurance that everything was moving exactly as it should. His mother sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. His father, though stern by nature, carried an uncharacteristic smile. Friends from every corner of his life were present, cheering silently, as though their very presence was proof of his worth. He had never felt so validated, so complete. Then the music shifted. The familiar notes of the wedding march swelled through the hall, and suddenly all the murmuring stopped. Every head turned, every pair of eyes fixed on the opening doors. There she was. His bride. She appeared framed by the massive oak doors, a vision in white that seemed almost otherworldly. The gown flowed like a river of light, each bead sewn into the fabric catching the glow of the chandeliers. A delicate veil softened her face, but not enough to hide the nervous, almost shy smile she wore. The crowd collectively inhaled, as if trying to hold on to this image forever. A few gasps rose from the guests, and one woman whispered, "She looks like an angel." The groom's chest tightened, not with doubt but with awe. He had seen her countless times, he knew every detail of her face, but something about this moment was different. This was not just the woman he loved, it was the woman about to become his wife. Every step she took down the aisle seemed to echo against his ribcage, each tap of her heel a countdown to forever. Her father held her arm, steady and proud, his chin raised as if he were presenting the most priceless treasure the world had ever known. And perhaps, in a way, he was. The bride's eyes darted toward the guests, catching familiar faces, friends, cousins, co-workers, all smiling, all watching her like she was the center of the universe. Yet when her gaze finally settled on the man waiting at the altar, her steps became steadier, her smile warmer. The groom's lips parted slightly. He wanted to say something, anything, but the lump in his throat silenced him. Instead, his eyes spoke the words he couldn't. "I can't believe this is real. I can't believe I get to spend my life with you." The hall felt suspended in time, each breath, each heartbeat synchronized to the rhythm of her walk. The flowers, the music, the grandeur of the moment, all of it faded, leaving only two people caught in the gravity of a promise not yet spoken. By the time she reached him, the world seemed to have shrunk to the small space between them. When her father placed her hand into his, the groom's palms were trembling. She looked up at him through her veil, her eyes shimmering like glass beneath water. The officiant's voice was distant, like a background hum, because nothing mattered more than the heat of her fingers against his own. The ceremony had only just begun, yet in his mind, it felt like he had already found eternity. The moment her hand slid into his, the music softened, and the officiant began to speak words about love, unity, and sacred vows. The hall, filled with attentive faces, seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost holy. But between the bride and the groom, another current moved, invisible to everyone else. She squeezed his hand, just slightly, and lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were trembling, though she smiled. To the crowd, she looked radiant, glowing with the weight of love. But to him, standing close enough to feel the rapid flutter of her pulse, something seemed off. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but she hesitated. The officiant paused for a breath, preparing to transition into the vows, and in that fragile pocket of silence, she leaned closer. Her veil brushed against his cheek. He thought she would whisper, "I love you," or, "You look so handsome." But what came out was nothing like that. Her voice cracked, barely audible, yet heavy enough to slice through his chest. "I have to confess, I slept with two men before this day." For a moment, he didn't react. His mind stalled, blank, unable to process the sentence. He blinked, forcing himself to believe he had misheard her. But the way her lips trembled, the guilt spilling from her eyes, told him he had heard perfectly. The world around him continued as if nothing had happened. Guests shifted in their seats, children whispered to each other, the violinist adjusted her bow. But inside him, silence detonated. He felt his chest tighten, his heart hammering against his ribs as though trying to break free. The bride's words ricocheted inside his head, repeating louder, faster, I slept with 2 men. I slept with 2 men. A part of him wanted to pull away immediately, to drop her hand and let the entire hall see his hurt. Another part of him wanted to pretend, to push the words aside and continue with the ceremony as if she had said nothing. But he couldn't. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe normally. His smile faltered just slightly, enough for the best man to notice, though the others in the audience remained oblivious. She glanced at him, eyes glistening with tears that hadn't yet fallen. Her lips quivered, and she whispered again, softer, urgent, I couldn't marry you without telling you. I couldn't keep it a secret. The betrayal of her timing cut sharper than the confession itself. Now, he thought, here, 5 seconds before our vows. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to leap into a future built on trust, only to realize the ground beneath had been hollow all along. He stared at her, searching for something in her face, remorse, explanation, maybe even love twisted with fear. He found all of it, but none of it settled the storm. His chest rose and fell, his breath heavier than it should have been. He thought about the nights they had spent planning the wedding, the promises whispered under starlight, the countless times she had sworn he was the only one. He thought about how his mother, in the front row, was smiling proudly, convinced her son had found a woman who would honor him. He thought about the money, the effort, the hope that had gone into this day. And now, all of it trembled on the edge of collapse. Yet the guests remained blind. From their perspective, it was a flawless ceremony. Some even dabbed their eyes, charmed by how close the couple stood. A few whispered about how deeply in love they looked, as if they were exchanging private words of affection. Only he knew those words were daggers. His throat burned with the urge to respond, to shout, to demand why she had chosen this moment. But his pride, his dignity, his very heart, chained him in silence. He tightened his grip on her hand, not in tenderness, but in control, to keep her from seeing how badly his knees threatened to buckle. The officiant's voice cut back in, oblivious, do you take this woman? The groom barely heard it. He looked at her again, his mind spiraling, torn between the urge to run and the instinct to stay. The confession was out, and nothing, no music, no vows, no blessing, could take it back. The hall was full, the moment irretrievable, and yet in the tiny space between their lips, it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing, waiting for his response. The officiant's words floated somewhere in the distance, a hollow echo that could not pierce through the storm inside his head. His bride's confession clung to him like a shadow he could not shake, heavier than the weight of the vows they were meant to exchange. He could feel dozens of eyes fixed on them, expectant, glowing with admiration, yet none of them knew the battle raging just inches away from the altar's polished floor. He inhaled sharply, trying to steady himself, and then exhaled through clenched teeth. The sound drew her eyes back up to his, desperate, pleading. He held her gaze for a long, burning moment. In that silence, he searched for the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had defended, cherished, and adored. What he saw instead was a stranger who had handed him a truth wrapped in cruelty, choosing the one moment when he could not escape, when he was cornered by family, friends, and faith. Guests whispered among themselves, sensing a shift. The bride's tears had begun to swell, making her veil shimmer faintly in the light, but to the crowd, it looked like the beauty of emotion. They thought it was love. They thought it was tenderness. He knew better. His heart pounded as he straightened his shoulders and tightened his jaw. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might walk away, abandon the ceremony altogether. But instead, he leaned closer to her, his voice low but firm enough to be heard by those in the front rows. You think your past defines us? It doesn't, he began. The audience froze, confused by the sudden rawness in his tone. But your choice to tell me now, here, in front of everyone, shows me who you really are. Gasps rippled through the crowd, sharp intakes of breath like waves hitting rocks. The officiant's mouth opened in shock, his script forgotten for a moment. The bride's lips parted, trembling, as if to explain, but her words caught in her throat. The groom didn't look away. His eyes burned with both pain and strength. He turned slightly, his voice louder now, carrying across the hall so every ear could hear. Marriage is built on trust. Not just honesty, but the timing of honesty. If you truly respected me, if you truly valued this day, you would have told me long before I stood here ready to give you my forever. Murmurs rose among the guests. Some clutched their chests, others whispered furiously into their neighbors' ears. The bride, crimson beneath her veil, shook her head rapidly, whispering, "Please, please don't do this. I love you. I couldn't live with the lie." His expression softened only for a second, a flicker of what had once been pure love, but then it hardened again. He reached up and brushed a tear off her cheek with his thumb, a gesture that looked tender to the crowd but felt like a final farewell. "Love is not what you confess at the altar," he said quietly. "Love is what you build before it. You've given me the truth, but you've stolen the choice of when and how I could face it. That's not love. That's selfishness." A stunned silence fell. The musicians, unsure, had stopped playing. The hall was now so quiet that the groom could hear the shallow breaths of the bride standing before him. Her tears streamed freely now, staining the fabric of her veil. "Don't leave me," she whispered, broken, her voice so small that only he could truly hear. He closed his eyes for a moment, as though steadying himself against the temptation to give in, to forgive instantly, to proceed with a heart already cracked. But when he opened them again, resolve had settled where hesitation once lived. He turned his face toward the officiant, then to the crowd, his voice calm yet thunderous in its finality. "This wedding cannot continue." Shock exploded through the room. A collective gasp surged like a wave. Mothers clutched their pearls, fathers shook their heads, and friends exchanged frantic looks. Some guests even rose halfway from their seats, unsure if they should intervene or remain still. The bride's knees buckled slightly, and she clung to his arm as though her grip could anchor him to her. "Please," she sobbed. "I told you because I wanted to start with honesty. I wanted to walk into marriage without secrets." He looked at her one last time, and though his features softened, his words did not waver. "And I wanted to walk into marriage with trust already intact. That's the difference." The words echoed through the hall, searing into every witness's memory. The hall was so silent it felt as though the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Every pair of eyes clung to the groom as his words, calm yet final, hung in the air. The bride remained frozen beside him, her hands trembling, her veil wet with tears that blurred her face into a portrait of despair. The officiant stood stiff, clutching the script of vows that now meant nothing. And then, almost as though on cue, the crowd erupted into a chaos of whispers. "Did you hear what she said?" A woman hissed in the third row. "He's right. She should have told him long ago," muttered another. "No, no, at least she told him. She was honest," argued someone else. The voices overlapped, creating a storm of judgment, pity, and disbelief. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should stay seated or stand. Others craned their necks to get a better look at the bride, their eyes sharp, dissecting her shame. The groom lifted his hand, palm out, and the murmurs died down instantly. His presence commanded the room now, not with anger, but with a gravity that demanded attention. He turned toward the sea of faces, his voice carrying with a steadiness that surprised even him. Today was meant to be about vows, about promises of love, respect, and truth. And in a way, he said, his tone unshaken, we still received truth. Just not the kind any of us expected. The bride sobbed quietly beside him, her shoulders trembling beneath her gown. He did not look at her as he continued. Marriage isn't destroyed by the past, it is destroyed by the present. By choices. By the way we honor each other, or betray each other, when it matters most. Love is not only about what we admit, but when we admit it. The hall listened as though he were delivering a sermon. Even the children, usually restless, sat still, wide-eyed. His words cut through the air like a blade sharpened by grief. "I don't stand here to shame her," he said, turning his head slightly toward the bride without letting his gaze linger. "I stand here to remind all of us that love is not a stage where we confess only when cornered. Love is a life lived with trust already built. I cannot marry her today, because the foundation was cracked the moment honesty became an afterthought." The officiant lowered his book, bowing his head, as if silently acknowledging the truth of the groom's words. The bride, clutching at her veil, whispered brokenly, "Please, forgive me," her voice cracked, echoing faintly through the hall. The groom finally looked at her, his expression no longer hard but deeply sorrowful. "Forgiveness is not the question," he said softly, so that only those closest could truly hear. "I could forgive you 100 times. But trust, once broken at the altar, cannot be rebuilt with vows spoken over it." Gasps rippled again. A few women dabbed their eyes with tissues, touched not only by the heartbreak but by the strength in his voice. Men shook their heads, some in sympathy for the groom, others in quiet agreement that his choice, however painful, was necessary. Slowly, he released her hand. The gesture was small, almost tender, but its meaning rang louder than any words. The bride staggered slightly, as though the absence of his touch had stripped her of the last bit of strength she clung to. She covered her face with her hands and wept openly, her sobs breaking through the silence like waves against fragile glass. The groom turned back to the guests once more. Let this day be remembered, not for what we lost, but for what we learned. Love demands truth, but it also demands courage to give it at the right time. Let no one here mistake silence for safety. Silence is what kills love before it has a chance to grow. With that, he stepped back from the altar. His shoes echoed against the marble floor as he walked down the aisle, each step heavy but resolute. The guests parted instinctively, making space for him as though they were watching a king in exile, dignified even in his fall. Some reached out to touch his arm as he passed, murmuring words of support, but he kept his eyes forward. His mother, tears streaking her cheeks, rose from the front row, her hand pressed against her heart. His father placed a steadying arm around her, nodding with a mix of grief and pride. At the altar, the bride collapsed into her father's arms, shaking uncontrollably. He wrapped her in his embrace, shielding her from the stares, but the damage was already done. The wedding was over. The fairy tale had dissolved into a lesson written in tears. As the groom pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the sunlight, he closed his eyes and drew in a deep breath. The world outside was wide, open, and waiting. He had walked away without a wife, but not without strength. Inside the hall, whispers continued, the story already taking root in every guest's memory. They would tell it again and again, the day a wedding turned into a truth too heavy for vows to carry.